Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law. Today we are at our guest's home in Philadelphia to interview one of the major intellectual figures of our time about two of his books. Our guest is Professor Paul Fussell. The two books are Doing Battle, The Making of a Skeptic, published in 1996, and The Boys Crusade, published in 2003. The 2-hour interview will be seen on two 1-hour-long segments of Books of Our Time. And I, of course, am the regular host of Books of Our Time, Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Paul, thank you very much for letting us come into your home in Philadelphia to tape these interviews. I will say to the audience that if at any point they hear noise in the background, it's because there is construction going on in the building, apparently. Yeah. But we hope that they jackhammer quietly.
Okay.
Paul, at the beginning, before you begin the text of Doing Battle, you have a prefatory remark which says the following, and I believe this will ultimately be put up on the screen. It says, late in the afternoon of March 15, 1945, in a small woods in southeastern France, Boy Fussell, aged 20, was ill-treated by members of the German Wehrmacht. His attackers have never been identified and brought to justice. How a young person so innocent was damaged this way, and what happened as a result, is the subject of this book. Paul, we'll fill in the specifics later, but in broad outline, what does this prefatory remark mean?
It means that my whole life since that moment has been a series of memories of that moment and an attempt to attach in some productive way those memories instead of just letting them fly off into bitterness or irrelevance, you know. I learned something that day. I learned that human beings are naturally murderous and that the only use of law is to contain that murderousness and so on. So you can see I'm not a great fan of the current Iraq adventure. Also, I hope that readers would be bright enough and literate enough to regard that little piece that you read as ironic. When I said that the people who injured me have not been brought to justice, of course not. They were troops in the German army following orders just like the rest of us. Nobody saw it as funny. I think readers have become so square and so anxious not to be amused by things unless those things are labeled funny or labeled comic, that it won't be very long before remarks like that can't be made anymore. People just won't get it.
Well, you know, I won't say that I considered it funny, but of course I understood that it was tongue-in-cheek because no one would ever know who fired those shots, for pity's sake.
And they had a perfect right to do so. Right. Indeed, it was their job, just as it was my job to avoid being hit by the shells.
Right. Well, we'll get into a lot of what occurred at that very moment. That very moment, obviously, I mean, this almost sounds trite, but it had this enormous, lifelong impact on you that occurred in an instantaneous second, a split second.
Yep.
Now, things like that normally, I think what you talk about today will show, things like that normally are the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. A lot underlies them, but bang, that thing happens, and that's it for a lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Paul, since joining the Army in, what was it, 1942 or 3, if I remember correctly?
43, but I had been in military training with the ROTC for many years before that time.
Right. But since joining the Army, your life has basically been a rejection, I gather, of what you learned as a boy until the age 18 or 19 in Pasadena, California. Why? And you describe Pasadena in a way that makes one think of Paradise Lost or the last hurrah of the privileged class, last hurrah of innocence of the privileged class. Why don't you tell the audience what life was like in Pasadena, in Balboa, and so forth in the 1920s and 30s?
The word privileged has to be used. Everybody I knew, both boys and girls, came from privileged backgrounds. Most of them went to private schools, and they thought that My family was extraordinary. My father was a lawyer, by the way, with the Melvin and Meyer, which is a standard L.A.
It was one of the big three firms in L.A. as late as the 60s.
Yeah, he insisted that his children go to public schools, and so I went to public schools all the way until I went to Pomona, which was a private college. And then I was in a virtual public school at Harvard because I was on the GI Bill most of the time. That's when I took my graduate degrees. But we were all a very privileged group. And the things we talked about was, have you got your car yet? Have your parents given you the car? Yeah. Have they given you the sailboat? Have they given you this? Have they given you that? Do you belong to the golf club? Et cetera, et cetera. It was that kind of upper class Monkey talk, because nobody was really upper class.
Yeah.
They didn't know the upper class lived on the East Coast.
Yeah,
They were essentially innocent people, but they were doing the best they could with the life roles that had been handed to them.
Yeah. Now, just to talk about them a little more, your father was apparently quite a brilliant guy, quite a straight arrow type guy, and really insisted on high standards of honesty, of reading, and other such things.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was really a character from the 19th century who somehow had landed in the 20th. He hated movies, and here we were 20 miles from where they were being manufactured in Hollywood. And he hated horse racing. He almost had a fit when Santa Anita so-called park was being built and furnished very close to where we lived, and so on. He thought that'll let all the riffraff in. He never put it that way, but that was clearly what his old world was vanishing.
Yeah.
Just as all older people's, like mine, old world vanishes.
Yeah.
I mean, I never caught on to what Derrida was getting at, you know, the great French literary critic and philosopher, because it was too remote from anything I could make sense out of. So I think everybody who grows old has this feeling. The trick is to conceal it as well as possible.
Well, I have to say that I like your father very much, and I guess that says something about me. You talk about Balboa.
Yeah.
Tell people what used to go on at Balboa, what it was and what used to go on.
Right. Balboa was a place that was used by us only in the summer. We had a summer house, a beach house it was called. If it had ever been called a beach home, we would have vomited in public. I mean, that's awful. That shows what's happened to the language since I've grown up. It was a beach house. Rich people had beach houses or they had mountain houses because Pasadena got very hot in the summertime. And if you could escape, you did. And so we all went to Balboa. And at Balboa, we of course belonged to a private yacht club which ran races of small sailboats. So each one of us had a small sailboat. I was terrible at winning races with it, but my brother got one. He was 2 years older than I was, and he was an expert winner of yachting races. That's enough to give you the general idea. The idea of appearing in public without a hat was unthinkable. And the idea of entering, say, a good restaurant without a necktie was unthinkable. So it was a different world. Partly because it was populated, where I came from, by more or less rich people. None of them had ever been to Europe. None of them had ever used their money to endow a college or anything. Except my father, who came to the rescue of Pomona College and helped it develop into something much larger than it was when I was there. But he had had the advantage of a year of study at the British University of Cambridge, because after his war, he was a second lieutenant in the First World War. The government, instead of a GI Bill, sent the officers, at least, to British universities, just to have something to do with them so they wouldn't take up room on the sidewalks. You know? And so he from his, he had both a BA and a Juris Doctor from the University of California. He was a superb, apparently emotionless person who insisted, without really insisting, on certain things for us. As I say in that book about weekly visits to the public library and so forth. And books conceived of as credible presents, you know, at Christmas and birthdays and so on. And as far as I can see, most of that has disappeared. I mean, I feel lost in a way in a world without popular understanding of books.
Yeah. Well, I will use this occasion to tell my family via television that if they want to buy me books for a present at Christmas or any other time, that's just fine.
Okay,
that's just fine
good,
with me.
good.
You know, the last thing perhaps about this, Paul, you talk about the weenie roast, and you know, it's not only a world that has disappeared largely, it's a world that wasn't known to most people.
Yes.
You say your dad went to college. Up until 1940, perhaps 50 or 60% of the American population did not go beyond high school.
Exactly, That has all changed now. And I've taught in 3 institutions, Connecticut College for Women it was when I taught there, and Rutgers University for many, many years, and more recently, the University of Pennsylvania. But I've also taught abroad, both in Germany and in England, and I've lived abroad, and I took my children to live in France so they would have decent French accents and so on. All that stuff is gone now. Nobody would waste time doing
you
that.
say in the book, this is what, I don't know whether I think this is poignant, tragic, or exactly what, but you say that it was a type of upbringing which, as some famous English writer put it, when one went off to war, one thought nothing bad could happen to me. Nanny wouldn't allow it.
Yeah, that's W.H. Auden.
That was Auden?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. We always had a maid. Every family I knew had a maid, and that was regarded as, you know, an act of nature. That's the way things were. You had maids.
Right.
And after the war, during which the maids had all worked, at least in Southern California, in the manufacture of airplanes and so on. After the war, there were no maids to be seen at all. Everything is different.
Just as a measure of how different, I recently read that up until about the first war, something like 1/3 of all Americans in labor, so to speak, were working as household employees. Amazing figure.
Amazing? Yeah, fantastic.
Amazing figure.
Yeah.
Paul, you say that in Pasadena and then in Pomona, where you went to college, you learned a lot about a lot of things, but you did not learn to think critically, and you say you did learn a lot from an essay by James Treslow Adams called The Mucker Pose.
Yes.
Why don't you explain those two things?
All right. When I was in college, it was fashionable for the college students to read essays by people that were thought to be wise Americans. And so I read this essay called The Mucker Pose. And a mucker poser is a person, almost always a male person, who lusts after the gutter out of a sense of shame at his privileges and so on. So he pretends to be, let's say, a pro football fan. Now, we are all pro football fans we don't think it's a low activity, but it was regarded then as a low activity. And so you learn to swear like a working class person, and you learn to see things and to explain things like a working class person. I never heard the phrase working class until I lived in England, actually. We would have called them poor or something like that. But the mucker pose, as that author saw it, was a technique for avoiding the presumed shame that attaches for having good luck in your birth and being born into an easy situation.
Yeah. Paul, do you think, I know this isn't in your book, and it's not quite what you're talking about, but I wonder whether you think it's related. Do you think that it doesn't pay in the America we know to appear too smart?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's what's called, I think it's what has caused what to my mind is the curious election results. The problem with Mr. Kerry was that he seemed to be an educated person. And he was doing that while his opponent was acting the cowboy, or something like that, the country person who loved life without books, without ideas, and so forth. I think that's really what won the election for him. And the Democrats were very slow catching on. You cannot represent yourself accurately or you'll lose.
Well, one last thing about Pomona. You say that Pomona taught character, but that it didn't teach you to think critically, and that in Pasadena and Pomona, you had to go with the group. You had to be a team player, be part of the group, and not stand out as being different.
Mm-hmm.
This hasn't changed too dramatically, has it, over the course of the years?
Not really, but I was released, actually, by my habit of wandering into the college library and picking books off shelves and looking into them. I was corrupted by H.L. Mencken. And nobody had heard of him by that time. This was in the 1940s. And nobody had dealt with him ever since 1930, for example. And he taught me how to penetrate silently into the way things really work and how contemptible certain things are, which are held to be valuable. And so he was my savior, in a way. And I recognized later, of course, that he was a mere journalist and very good at that, but he was no guide to life. But he helped release me from gentility and echoing the mob. And then he and the author of The Mucker Post sort of coalesced and became the same warning voice.
Well, and then, of course, you say, we'll get into it later, but you didn't learn that all at once. You learned that over a period of, the whole business you learned over a period of, say, 15 or 20 years.
Well, less than that, actually, because when I came out of the Army, I spent almost 4 years in it, in Europe. And when I came out of the Army, I was virtually made in the mold that it has continued, except I'm not military anymore. And what I've done is to use the techniques that I learned as an undergraduate once I discovered Mencken as a teacher of the humanities in an age when the humanities are unknown, and where I think it's extremely valuable that they be known. And so on. For me, they were a replacement for religion. And they were the only source of moral understanding. And to see people neglecting them was the way a Catholic would feel if he perceived everybody sneering at the Mass. To me, they were an absolutely necessary preparation for the real world, which most people didn't recognize.
I know that you talk about, and we will talk about, the idea that there have to be cultural constraints on leaders, and that leads to the question of what are those cultural constraints and why do you feel that way? And it's obvious you feel that the current president is not subject to those cultural constraints.
Well, I feel that way because the one reality you have as you grow older is that you are a creature embedded in history. And you must know what history is. You start with Greek thinkers of antiquity and you move up through Shakespeare and contemporary writers and thinkers and so on to cure you of the notion that you are unique. You're not. You've been manufactured by hordes of proceedings before you. And that is the source of the constraint. People ask, what would Jesus think? I say, what would Aristotle think, you dumbass, et cetera, et cetera.
This all, Paul, I gather from both of the books, well, from doing battle, that this transformation, as it were, all started with the Army. And we'll get into the things that caused the transformation in the Army, in combat, after the war. But as a consequence of this transformation, you developed 10 or 15, or however, I mean, one can count them in different ways. I make it to be about 12 or 15 different fundamental viewpoints about life. And I would like to go through those viewpoints because as fascinating as your personal experiences are, and we will get into them entirely because they are what caused this set of values to be adopted. I would like to bring out to the audience, first of all, what this set of values are. So let me start with this. You say you are an ironist, which doesn't mean, what do you mean when you say you are an ironist?
I see the opposite of every experience or proposition, which makes an ironic comment on it. The main ironic comment is that life is a preparation for death. So come on, grow up, you see? That's what I've been selling to students for my lifetime. And the opposite of every injunction is true. And you have to hold that fact when you believe in the injunction or the axiom about life you have to realize that it has its opposite.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
the two together constitute the knowledge. But if you leave out the opposite, you
Yeah,
are
yeah.
witless.
Would you agree with me, Paul? Here's an idea that I've never ever expressed publicly, or even to a friend, but it certainly it came back to my mind when I read what you had to say, and that is, our government, or virtually any institution, oversells the ultimate results of the actions it wishes to take, and ignores the potential downsides, because unless you oversell and make people think that this will lead to nirvana, people won't buy your position.
Quite true. And that goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. America is a unique operation. Most people aren't educated enough to know that. But European understanding always has an ironic opposite lurking around the corner somewhere. We don't. We're supposed to be happy people in a happy environment where we can control it with elections and that sort of thing. And everything about America has to be wonderful. And people who know something know that cannot be true. And you have to live with that knowledge. And that is an ironic view of, general life.
Paul, we have to break for a moment here for a public service commercial. But when we come back, what I'd like you to comment on is whether the selling of Russia, as it were, during World War II was an example of what we're talking about. It was just too much to be true, and immediately after the war, it changed around 100%. So if you would comment on that as soon as we come back, I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with Professor Paul Fussell in an interview taken from his home in what they call Philadelphia Center City, Philadelphia.
Center City, yeah.
Hi, Jeff. No, I'm still at the train station. I just almost got killed. Yeah, about 10 minutes ago. I'm still shaking. Well, I got off the 940 and Jill called. Yeah, it was raining, and so I put the newspaper over my head. I forgot my umbrella, and I didn't want to go walk over the overpass. And then I heard the whistle and the light. I was walking right into a train. This guy, he pulled me back.
Look, listen, and live, or someone you love will get hurt.
I just almost died.
How far would you go to help someone? Would you go to the end of your driveway? Would you cross a street? Would you cross an ocean? To a place 6,000 miles from home? And how long would you go? Would you go for a week? A month? A year? Would you go for 2 years? Would you go if you could use your knowledge to teach someone, and in the process, maybe learn something yourself? Life is calling. How far will you go? Peace Corps.
Welcome back. Paul, why don't you comment on the extent to which the propaganda about Russia was indicative of what you had been talking about?
Yeah. Public life in America, at least as it's conducted by means of language, is virtually indistinguishable from advertising. And this is the great country that taught advertising to the world. Now, we as living here know that advertising is false. It's fun, but nobody believes in it anymore, who knows anything at all. It's a massive American joke, but it makes money for people and it moves goods around. And so nobody objects at all. It's rather fun, to follow the ads. But we're the country that taught the world to do that. And ads promise happiness in some way. And therefore, we are unique, and if people living here hope to grow up, they have to look at advertising not just skeptically, but with contempt, always. Now, the trouble with certain of our national administrations is that they conduct themselves as if they were an ad agency. And they don't see that, if you're elected to public office, you're not elected to tell lies. And that's hard for many people to understand that. But it must be understood or we'll get nowhere.
It's interesting, isn't it, Paul? Two things are interesting. One, nobody believes advertising, and yet advertising causes people to go out and buy like crazy.
That's right. Well, they engage in the fun of expectation. It's fun to hope for things.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing about national administrations, you've mentioned the current administration, so people might think, well, Professor Fussell, he's a Democrat or he's a liberal, he's out after the current. No, Woodrow Wilson sold the First World War on the theory that it will make the world safe for democracy and it'll be the end of all wars.
And we're still working at that. That's what we're trying to do in Iraq. We've learned nothing.
Right. And in World War II, the administration sold Russia as, well, peons to Russia, our great friends and allies.
That's right.
And immediately afterwards, boom, it all turned off.
We caught on.
Yeah, we caught on.
Quite right.
And Vietnam, the same. Well, it goes on and on and on. So there's nothing new about this. Paul, another one of your fundamental ideas is it goes by a lot of related names. It's called the mutability and evanescence of life, the pathos of the transient, the fact that all is destined to change and disappear. Want to elaborate on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I probably got that from the ancient Greeks, which was an automatic understanding of theirs. They didn't know it was an automatic understanding, but they wrote about it frequently. It also has something to do with the now ignored Christian Bible, which is on that subject. That what you're doing now is not going to last forever, and you better look out because you may be either punished or changed in some happy way, and so forth. The whole world used to be founded upon the idea of mutability or changeableness. Everything is going to change. If you're in bad luck today, it's not going to last forever. That's what I used to tell my soldiers in the Army. They would come bitching and moaning about the awfulness of it all. And I said, look, this war is not going to last forever. Just hold on. It's going to quit after a while, and you're going to survive it. So quit your complaining.
That's kind of a reverse twist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because the bad changes to the good, but the good, what you seem to focus on more is that we're this highly over-optimistic society, and even when you're initially successful, the good changes to the bad ultimately anyway.
Yeah, that's right. But I never put it that way because I, being an American, participate in the sense that if you do something, you will be a survivor on a higher plane than you are now.
Yeah. Paul, to some extent it has seemed to me that the things you described, the pathos of the transient, the fact that everything is going to change and all will grow old and die and so forth, that to a large extent this reflects what I would call the plight of the sensitive man in American society. Is there any merit to that view?
Yeah, but without any self-flattery or anything, that seems to me natural. And the people I know and like and admire are people who share that understanding.
Yeah.
And it doesn't bother them at all. I mean, they don't go whining to the psychiatrist every moment and so forth. And that they survive the bad parts of life without any trouble because they have expected them from boyhood sometimes. And that's where the war was extremely important for me.
Right.
Whether you want to be killed or wounded or not, you're going to be. So wake up and quit bitching about it and do your best.
Yeah. I was just talking to somebody who had been in Vietnam, and of course I'd read your books, and I'd read the similar ideas before, and he said, well, when it got tough was when you were in short time. The last month, that's when it was tough. Before that, you figured, well, I'm never going to make this anyway, so what the hell?
That's right.
It's the last month or so, that's when you really got worried.
Yeah, you think I may survive, so I better look out.
I better look out.
Right.
I noted that in discussing this question of American over-optimism, you mentioned two things. One was that our people had never been taught how to retreat, which they say is the most difficult operation in the conduct of a war, which led to which helped along the disasters at the Bulge. And the other one was the High Command. Maybe you could comment on this. The High Command's over-optimism about, just like McNamara said in Vietnam, home by Christmas, they thought that Germany would have collapsed by Christmas.
Well, we all did that because we were beating them in such a flagrant way at the end. I mean, destroying their cities every night and, oh boy, capturing them by the hundreds and the thousands at one go. It looked as if the war would be over very soon, which is what made the Battle of the Bulge so shocking, because they indicated, God, they've got a lot left and we better look out. We better learn how to fight in the snow and so forth. That's exactly the way it was.
And as I understand it, we outran our gasoline supplies.
We did indeed. And one thing I missed was the end of the war, because I was in a hospital with wounds at that time. And we had only a radio. There was no such thing as television. And I heard a little bit of Army news on the radio, and that was all. I was isolated. And the whole thing ended without my presence, and that annoyed me very much.
As opposed to Dean Acheson, who said he was present at the creation, you wanted to be present at the end.
That's right.
Right. You talk a lot, and you've already mentioned here on this program a little bit, about euphemism in speech.
Yes.
Which one of your first girlfriends first identified, apparently, when she said that they call somebody, say somebody has a kleptomaniac problem when he's a thief.
That's right, yeah.
You still find that, I take it, to be rampant in society, particularly with regard to war.
Absolutely, and it's unavoidable with wartime, which is the title of one of my books, by the way, Wartime, How Different It Is from Peacetime. Wartime brings in all kinds of necessary euphemisms and evasions. Otherwise, people would become mutinous. In my sense.
Well,
as they virtually did during the Vietnam War. I mean, it just reached absolute absurdity, and people quit. They ran away. In the Second World War, sometimes they shot their NCOs or their officers. They shot themselves sometimes, and none of this material ever escaped the euphemizing machinery. It all had to, there was no public way you could say, be careful of that guy, he tried to kill himself. It wasn't acceptable.
Well, in Vietnam we called it fragging, we called it protective reaction, and then advanced protective reaction when we were bombing Cambodia.
Exactly. No war can serve. This is the most awful thing about war, not that it is damaging to the human body, but that it ruins everything else. It ruins everything human. That it's the critical habit of mind, indeed the celebratory habit of mind. Everything has to be false. And we're experiencing that at the moment.
We are experiencing that at the moment, indeed. When we talk, as we did in Nam and in the first Gulf War, we talk about collateral damage. That means we're killing women and children by the gross.
Exactly. It's like friendly fire. Which means erroneous aiming.
Nothing could be more unfriendly.
That's right.
We'll get into some of that you saw too. All these basic ideas of yours tie together, I think, as the audience can tell as we go from one to the other, and they all seem to be related somehow. Another one is that you feel that in this country, for many years now, apparently, militarism has been romanticized, and we are still in the middle of romanticizing militarism.
And this is really why I was attracted to the subject which I worked out in the Boys Crusade. Now, that was not my idea, actually. Random House. I had written something else for Random House. I was on their list of authors. They went down the list of authors and they say, we would like from you a short book on a subject that you know well. What do you want to do? And some people did political books because that was what they did, and so forth. And I said, I'll have to write something about the Second World War. And so they said, what'll it be? And I said, I'd like to write about the curious boyishness of the operation from my point of view, because I was a lieutenant. I had 40 souls, under my hands, and at the time I was only 20 years old, and they were 18 years old, so they weren't, visibly childish. But in many ways that posed problems, and it was a very interesting, ironic fact that these people pretending to be murderers are simply trained children. And so I thought I'll write about that, and that's how that book started.
Yeah.
Left to myself, I think I wouldn't have written a short book.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you weren't left to yourself, Paul, because that is a phenomenal book in my judgment. One of the interesting things about it to me is this. When I was in 1957, when I was in college, we read a Hemingway short story called The Short Happy Life of Francis McComber.
Yes.
And our professor pointed out it was not the short comma happy life of Francis McComber, it's the short happy life of Francis McComber, which makes all the difference in the world.
Absolutely.
And the Boys Crusade, you took the title in a sense from the Children's Crusade, which is a way of identifying who did the crusade.
Yeah.
But the Boys Crusade, you could pronounce it the Boys Crusade because it turned out to be a crusade. And also, it was by a bunch of children.
Yeah.
So the title has all kinds of ramifications to it.
Exactly. And as I said at the end of that book, once we got to the concentration camps and saw that because we were winning the war, they would have to close down, the kids began to realize that it was something like a crusade.
Yeah.
And then they stopped complaining about being in the Army, and I, to a degree, did the same thing. We saw that we had been engaged in, I'd say, almost a pseudo-religious operation. I mean, we were after wickedness and evil, and we'd extirpated it, and that was a good thing. Yeah,
there is evil in the world. You think it is wrong to, as we have done, Ambrose, Brokaw, the movies, John Wayne. For 50 years we have glorified or heroized World War II. You think there's something not quite right about that?
Well, the bad thing about it is that it confuses people's understanding of what entertainment is as opposed to history. History is not entertaining. Historiography, that is, the writing of history, is not a game. It is a scholarly procedure which is very difficult to imitate or to learn. And people, now, once they watch John Wayne cleaning up some battle situation easily, and they get the impression that that's the way things are. No, that's the way entertainment is. You don't go to the movies to be depressed. You go to be entertained. Yesterday, my wife and I spent the afternoon watching this wonderful film about motorcycle. It's called something like that. It's about the origin of Che Guevara as a revolutionary. And although we're not revolutionaries by any means, it was a wonderful example of these two guys who set off on a motorcycle full of fun and their introduction to a world which is not fun, that is the world of the poor in South America. And it was a fine example of the rare use of cinema in a moral way and in an instructive way that wasn't really entertaining. There were entertaining moments, but the point was, change your life, you dumbass. That's what it was saying. And I like that very much.
Paul, recently, a couple of years ago, a fellow, I've forgotten his last name, it might be Christian, I'm not sure, wrote a book called Working Class War about Vietnam. And it was shocking how many kids who were in Vietnam thought Vietnam was going to be the kind of lark that had been displayed by John Wayne time and again in all these World War II movies. John Wayne was a horrendous influence on this country, I think.
He was indeed, and that's to his credit because he mastered that style of acting and made it his own. He was sort of it's what we have instead of John Gielgud.
And you say, and I thought this is very poignant, you say, watch the first half hour of Private Ryan. That's what it was like. After that, forget the rest of the movie.
That's right. And just yesterday I saw something on television about how wonderful that whole movie was. I mean, people were unable to clip off the really historic part about the horror of Omaha Beach and mistake that for a continuity with the rest of the book, which is a boy's adventure story. Utterly unreal. I mean, the captain there who leads his men to finding Private Ryan wears a helmet with two
Bars.
Stripes on the
Yeah,
front.
yeah.
If you'd done that, you would have been shot in a moment in the
yeah,
real war.
yeah.
We concealed the fact
Yeah.
that we were officers.
Yeah, yeah. You talk about taking the stripes off, taking everything off. You couldn't tell who was. Just
That's
like
right.
in old wars, the Civil War, where they aimed for the man on horseback.
Exactly.
Same principle.
And it was our covering up those indications of command that annoyed General Patton so much. I mean, he thought it was awful.
Yeah, yeah. Paul, one of the most poignant things you talk about, because personally I think it's largely true, is that one of the reasons people romanticize war, and this is responsible for a lot of other bad things, is people lack imagination and they lack sympathy and empathy. And your books apparently are an attempt by almost minimalist, but nonetheless horrendously moving and gripping descriptions to bring home to people what this is really all about.
Yes, but if people don't read, they never know that, and they're not reading. Now, they're getting it from television, and obviously television is supposed to be entertainment, including the news programs.
Yeah.
And they never deliver really bad news. They say we lost 20 soldiers today, but they're fighting, and we're, et cetera. It's going to be better.
Frankly,
Hold
one
on.
of the best, one of the most, from its standpoint, one of the best things this administration did, in my judgment, and you couldn't say this at the time, or you were regarded as a traitor, was to embed all those people with the force as well. That's like putting in the Michigan cheering section. Yeah, I mean, that's just,
absolutely.
yeah.
And it exploits the principle of courage that I found by experience. That is, you do brave acts in combat because people you know are watching. They're your friends. And you can't turn and run and leave them there and so forth, no matter how scared you are, how much you hate what you have to do.
Yeah.
And it's the same principle, I think.
Yeah, and that too, by the way, was learned in the Civil War, although I don't know that people wrote about it until 1970, 1980. We have to take another break, and after that, we'll come back to the last segment of the first hour of the interview. Stay with us, we'll be right back.
Integrity first. Service before self. Excellence in all we do. These are not just words. These are our core values. Values by which each and every member of the Air Force Reserve lives. So whether we are deploying humanitarian aid, or providing natural disaster relief, or defending freedom wherever it's threatened, the men and women of the Air Force Reserve are there, protecting our values and serving our country. Air Force Reserve, above and beyond.
There is strength in our numbers. Our call is to action, to practice what we preach. Be there to care. Our passion is compassion. We're only human, but together we're humane. Our letters stand for taking a stand, for taking the lead, for filling the need. The American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Be part of our heart.
Exercise your emotions. Attend a live orchestra concert. Go to findaconcert.com.
Welcome back. Paul, as I think we may have touched on, you say that language is used to romanticize war, as when, for example, we speak of a particular infantry division as, you know, the Big Red One, the title of a movie, which is just being released now, you know, the Big Red One. And apropos of that, you feel that, in fact, to look at it from the opposite side of the coin, the lot of the infantrymen in warfare is so terrible that unless one has experienced it, people's imaginations are simply not up to really understanding what it's all about.
I think that's in part the motive of what I call cutism. A Big Red One is a fine example. But another motive for it is to turn war and its appurtenances into toys. Big Red One suggests a little child's toy, and the toys are not dangerous, and they're fun, and you share them with others and so forth. So I think that's another motive, but I'd accept your understanding of the motive as well.
Yeah. Now, you really take on the shibboleths of this country when you say that, in your opinion. I mean, you take them on about a lot of things, right? But in particular, when you say that, in your opinion, the American Army in World War II in Northern Europe was inept from top to bottom.
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, it had a lot of points of non-competence. Would that be fair?
Yeah, because we were amateurs. I mean, there were a few West Pointers in it, and there was nobody in it except people who were not really fighting, who'd been in the First World War.
Yeah.
Nobody knew what a war was like. We had to learn. And we were all amateurs. I mean, the officers were all virtually drafted. I was in the ROTC. And being in the ROTC, I was granted an extra year of time at college. There was a reward for staying in that branch because I was going to become an officer. But we had to learn it from the start. And before I could become an officer, I had to be totally basic trained. And I ended up as a private, and then I became a private first class, and then I became a corporal, and then finally I made it to officer's school. But it was learning all the way. And you don't know anything about war unless you've been in one, unless you've seen what problems are likely to develop, and those things are never talked about.
Yeah, you say, well, of course, they weren't talked about in ROTC. You make that point.
Yeah.
And you make the point that to survive, one had to unlearn a lot of the things one was taught stateside, such as the principle of always using a flank attack.
That's right. Yeah, which is the essential principle of attacking from the flank or behind the enemy infantry unit. But it is not applicable to small units because the leader has to get out there and locate the flank. You can't do that because the people attacking you from the front are invisible. You don't see them at all. You just know they're firing at you. You'd like to get around their flank, but you don't do it.
You don't know where the flank is.
You have no idea.
Yeah, you might be walking straight into another machine gun.
Yeah, but as I said in the book, I think, I understood that principle once I realized that its function wasn't to tell the truth. Its function was to give us courage. I mean, if it was thought by anybody that we could do that, we must be braver than we imagine. Yeah. And it had usefulness that way.
And this also was what you called one of George Marshall's school solutions.
Yeah, it was a school solution. Yeah. At Fort Benning, which was training junior infantry officers, the school solution was always presented. You were asked what you would do with the thing, and then you would say, well, what's the school solution? What have you decided in your wisdom ought to be done? And then you were expected to embrace that solution.
And when you got out into the real light, it often turned out there. Paul, you say something which is a real shibboleth, which is the Germans had better equipment, and when we fought them on even terms, they generally won because they had better equipment, from tanks to automatic machine guns, to Red Cross tabards, to litter sleds. I mean, everything they had was better in your judgment, or not everything. Lots of stuff they had was better.
Yeah, well, that was true of the small unit fighting that I was engaged in. They were cleverer than we were. They were better trained, and the superiority in materiel they had was obvious. Our tanks caught fire when they were hit and burnt up the crews. Their tanks ran on diesel. And I don't think America had heard of diesel at that stage. Yeah. And we would have used it if we'd known about it, but we didn't know, and so forth. Yeah. But the junior officer leadership of the German ground forces was extraordinarily good.
Yeah. You talk, I seem to remember, I don't know that you talk, yeah, you do talk about it, but I've often read that the Sherman tank was called a Ronson.
It was called a Ronson after the cigarette lighter that the troops all used, yes. And, that's an example of sort of, what should we call it, simple humor. is invoked all the time by soldiers to make the thing possible.
Yeah.
Make it possible to go on with the war from the on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, they went up by cigarette lighters was the idea.
That's right.
Yeah. I take it that you think that the Germans lost that war because they had that we had too much air power, too much artillery, and we had the Russians coming at them from the other side simultaneously.
No, that's a large part of it. Yeah, but that says that the American infantry didn't fight as well as it could, which it did, and numerous young lives were lost while it was in the process of doing that. And that should not be forgotten.
Yes, yes. And in the process of learning as well as in the process of fighting its way across France. Paul, you talk about the infantry bearing the brunt of wars, and the infantry being basically working class people. You do say that the infantry was something like 14% of the armed forces and bore 70% of the casualties.
Yes.
This is fantastic. Why don't you elaborate on these feelings that you have about the infantry being like the laboring class, or being the laboring class, basically?
Well, most people didn't know that. Well, they did know it, but they knew nothing could be done about it. You know, you can't make working men into aristocrats, and everybody cannot be an officer, and so forth. So certain facts of life were true, but were never invoked. Yeah.
But all these wars, are they not? Basically, the ground wars are basically fought by working class people.
Absolutely. I never met an enlisted man who had been to college, even community college, which weren't invented until afterwards. They were all either high school kids in the senior year who had quit, or they were recent high school graduates, or they'd never been to school at all. You found that sometimes. You had to teach them everything. For a long time, not a long time, a short time, I taught in an infantry division. This was after the war, but it was clear that the soldiers lacked elementary instruction. So I was employed as a teacher of writing English, speaking English, public speaking, and similar things that belong to a high school education. A lot of kids hadn't had even that.
Yeah.
And those people were probably captains and majors by the time they fought in Vietnam.
Yeah. You know, back in the Civil War, Paul, they had recruits who didn't know their left from their right, and they used to teach them to march by going left foot, hay foot, left foot, hay foot. Goodness gracious me. And it's never changed. The infantry to this day in Iraq is, largely working class kids.
Right. But it does good. I mean, that was the first time I ever met any real people who were not aristocrats. Aristocrats manqués.
Yeah, I understand. But you also make the point time and again that in war, these people who were in the infantry, and who some people from the aristocratic or the manqué or color, even the middle class met, they just wouldn't ever have met these people otherwise. They'd never know them. They'd go out, you make the point, they'd go out of their way to avoid them in civilian life.
That's true. Yeah, so I'm very lucky that I had that experience, and it means a lot to me. I hear from them now and then. I mean, they sent me charming, illiterate letters. Wonderful.
Yeah. You remember Kipling's poems, Tommy this and Tommy that, and get out, you're drunk and loud, but something like savor your country when the guns begin to shout, or something on that order. I don't have it exactly right, but it's something on that order.
Then they're forgotten in peacetime, quite right.
Yeah. Paul, you make the point time and again, and you've touched on it at the inception of this interview. What happened to you filled you with an anger which is apparently never dissipated.
I think if they were real soldiers, if they were infantry troops, especially riflemen, they've never gotten over it. No, quite right.
And it has propelled a lot of your writing, you say?
Yes, indeed it has. All of it, I would say, except my work in, explicating 18th century British literature, which I liked because it was redeemingly ironic and snotty. I liked that. I ended up the snottiest person you ever saw. It was wonderful. When I was being interviewed by colleges for my first job, I lost all the interviews because I was so snotty. I'd tell people, what's wrong with your English department? And so forth. I had no idea of my rudeness and so forth. But I had earned that, in the best college in the world, which is the Army.
And even better in the infantry.
Yes.
And today, interviews and everything else are so programmed. There's so much instruction one gets on what to do that, you know, one could hardly imagine somebody going into an interview and being snotty today. But who knows? Perhaps the last thing we ought to talk about is that you really object strongly to a phenomenon that I think started with economists, and it seems to pervade the country today. That is the phenomenon of talking in quantitative terms about people and then talking of people as abstractions. And one of your great examples, of course, was the Repo Depot program during the war. Why don't you elaborate on all of that?
Yes. Well, in infantry combat, the unit you're in, let's say a platoon or a company consists of 200 men, a platoon of about 40, it gets smaller all the time as people are killed and wounded, which is the point. I mean, that's what you're there for. And those people have to be replaced. And they're replaced by innocent youngsters who've never known anything about combat. And they're stuck into empty places to fill the unit out again. Well, in actual combat, it turns out that they don't know enough to avoid being killed or wounded right away. You know, if they're in a bush and invisible to the enemy, they will stick their head out to see what's going on and instantly get a bullet in the forehead.
Yeah.
Nobody's told them these things, and there hasn't been time to train them adequately. So I wrote quite a bit about that. In the unit I was in, which was a rather new division, there were fewer empty holes than in the old ones, but something like the 1st Division. By the time it entered the European War at the Omaha Landing, it wasn't the 1st Division anymore. It was an accumulation of kids who were replacements, who hadn't been trained and who knew nothing about the 1st Division's history in the First World War. They had nothing to be proud of, you know. And that is very seldom noted. I felt guilty actually talking about it in my book, The Boys Crusade.
Yeah.
Because most of the kids, well, I was lucky, about half my soldiers as a junior officer were originals.
Yeah.
But there was another half that didn't know what to do.
You know, you point out that from the standpoint of pure numerical efficiency, this made a lot of sense because you could be able to plug gaps, holes, and so forth in the units. But as a matter of the way people get treated, the matter of the unit's fighting effectiveness, or the matter of the people's ignorance, in short, as a matter of the way people actually act, this made no sense whatsoever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think I give an example of some troops, of some American troops that were fighting the war in Italy. And they got something like 5 replacements all at once. And so they sent those replacements out on a very dangerous patrol, and they were, of course, all killed immediately. They'd been with the unit maybe a day or so.
Yeah.
And that kind of human reaction would seem beyond the reach of the people who conceived of this individual replacement idea. That's a business school idea, I think.
We have to wrap this one up. We will continue, particularly with all the experiences you wrote about in the next segment of this show. To the audience, be with us again for the second segment of our 2-hour-long interview with Professor Paul Fussell. Thanks for being with us. Be with us again.
This is Alan. He has cancer. This is Sarah. They've been together 46 years.
Way to go, sweetheart. Now go get it.
This is the number they called when he was diagnosed, so they could get answers to their questions.
Kiss that ball.
So they could get through this together. This is the American Cancer Society. This is who to call for help.
I love you.
Every year, almost 14,000 women in our country die from ovarian